Imagine descending into the Pacific Ocean. Not a few meters, not 50, but hundreds of meters beneath the surface. Down there, sunlight has almost disappeared. The water is cold, the pressure is enormous, and the seafloor can look almost completely empty. But off the coast of Costa Rica, scientists found something extraordinary: a golden forest. Not trees, not plants, coral. Bright yellow, delicate and strangely beautiful coral rising from the deep sea floor, and surrounding it, thousands of tiny brittle stars. The scene looked almost unreal. So unreal, in fact, that scientists initially thought they could identify the coral. They were wrong, because when they examined it closely, they couldn't place it inside any known coral family. Eventually, they had to create a new one. This is the story of Laurinque elenya, a creature that forced scientists to redraw part of the coral family tree. Most of us imagine the ocean as one enormous blue environment. But the ocean isn't really one world. It's thousands of different worlds stacked on top of each other. Near the surface, sunlight fuels enormous ecosystems. But as you descend, the light begins disappearing. Eventually, you enter a place where sunlight can no longer support ordinary photosynthesis. And hundreds of meters below the surface, the environment becomes something completely different. Cold, dark, high pressure, and difficult for humans to explore. This is one reason the deep ocean remains one of the least understood environments on Earth. Scientists can spend years studying a particular region and still discover organisms that have never been formally described. That's exactly what happened off Costa Rica. In the Pacific Ocean, around the seamounts near Isla del Coco, researchers were exploring underwater mountains rising from the deep sea floor. They weren't looking at an empty desert. They were looking at a hidden ecosystem. And somewhere among it was something they had never properly understood. In 2019, marine biologist Odalis Gabridi saw the coral garden for the first time. And the landscape was unusual. Imagine the deep sea floor covered with brittle stars. Thousands of them, their thin arms spread across the rocky bottom. And rising through this field of stars were delicate golden yellow coral colonies. They looked almost like miniature trees. Some colonies could grow to more than a meter tall. The effect was extraordinary, a forest in darkness, surrounded by stars. And this strange appearance would eventually influence the creature's scientific name. But at first, the researchers had a more ordinary thought. Perhaps this coral belonged to a family scientists already knew. That would have been the simple explanation. Identify it, place it on the coral family tree, move on. But biology doesn't always cooperate. The first clue came from the animal's physical structure. This was an octocoral. Like other octocorals, its colonies are made from many tiny individual animals called polyps, but the arrangement, the growth pattern, and microscopic skeletal structures called sclerites didn't match the combination scientists expected. It looked familiar, but not familiar enough. Imagine finding an animal that resembles several known species, but doesn't actually belong with any of them. That's the kind of problem taxonomists love, and sometimes hate. Because classification isn't simply about appearance. Scientists increasingly use genetics to determine evolutionary relationships. So the researchers collected additional material, and in 2023, they returned to the site. More specimens, more observations, more genetic material. Now they could ask a much bigger question. Where does this coral actually belong? Scientists often use specific genes as biological markers. Think of them as molecular clues. You sequence a gene, compare it with related species, and see where the new organism fits. So the researchers sequenced several commonly used coral genes. And something strange happened. The different genes didn't tell exactly the same story. One gene suggested one relationship, another suggested something different, another pointed somewhere else. The evolutionary signal was unusually confusing. The researchers needed more information, so they moved beyond a handful of genes. They used phylogenomics. Instead of looking at just a few genetic markers, they examined hundreds of genes across the genome. This is where the mystery finally began to resolve. The coral wasn't simply a strange member of an existing family. It represented its own evolutionary lineage, a lineage different enough, both genetically and anatomically, to deserve a new family. And that meant something remarkable. Scientists weren't just naming a new species, they were creating an entirely new branch on the coral family tree. The new genus was named Laurinque, and the species Laurinque elenya. The name is almost as beautiful as the animal. Laurinque is a word from Tolkien's fictional Elvish language, Quenya. It refers to a golden tree. And that's exactly what the researchers saw, a golden tree-like coral rising from the deep sea floor. The species name, elenya, means stellar or associated with stars. That refers to the enormous fields of brittle stars surrounding the coral colonies. So the scientific name essentially evokes golden trees among stars. And suddenly, the deep sea floor begins to sound like another world. But there is something important to remember. This isn't fantasy. This isn't Middle Earth. This is Earth, a real ecosystem hundreds of meters below the Pacific surface. The brittle stars are not simply decoration. They are part of the ecosystem. Their arms cover the rocky seafloor, and the coral grows among them. This creates a spectacular three-dimensional habitat. The coral rises upward, the brittle stars spread outward, and other organisms can use the structure created by the coral as living habitat. That's one reason deep-sea coral gardens matter. Corals aren't simply beautiful objects. They can create physical complexity in an otherwise relatively open environment. Their branches provide surfaces, shelter, attachment points, and places where other organisms can live. So when you discover a new coral, you may also be discovering an entire ecosystem that scientists barely understand. And that brings us to an important question. How long has this ecosystem been here? The deep ocean is enormous, and compared with terrestrial ecosystems, it is remarkably difficult to explore. You can't simply walk into it. You need ships, submersibles, remotely operated vehicles, specialized cameras, robotic arms, and enormous amounts of time. The coral was observed using the remotely operated vehicle, Sebastian, operating from research vessels during expeditions to Costa Rican seamounts. Think about what that means. A human being isn't simply swimming down to the coral. A robot is sent into the darkness. A camera travels hundreds of meters beneath the surface, and suddenly a landscape appears on a monitor. A landscape nobody on the ship has seen before. That's how much of the deep ocean is still revealed to us. One expedition, one camera, one unexpected organism, and suddenly our understanding changes. But perhaps the strangest thing about Laurinque elenya isn't its color, it isn't its shape, it isn't even the fact that it required a new family. It's what the discovery tells us about our planet. Scientists had already explored this part of the Pacific. Researchers had already collected samples. They already knew genetic tools. They already knew many coral families. And yet, this organism still managed to surprise them. It was hiding in a world that is physically difficult for us to reach, and its evolutionary history was unusual enough that even specialists couldn't immediately identify where it belonged. That tells us something profound. We don't merely have undiscovered animals in remote forests. We have entire evolutionary branches hidden beneath the ocean. Think about what makes this scene so strange. A forest normally means sunlight, leaves, roots, soil, trees competing for light. But this forest has none of those things. There is no sunlight feeding the coral, no leaves, no roots, no soil. Instead, there is darkness, cold seawater, rock, and animals filtering food from the water. The coral doesn't need to look like a tree to be a tree-shaped ecosystem. Its branches create structure, its polyps capture food, and its presence changes the physical environment around it. The result is a kind of architecture built by animals in a place where almost nobody can visit.
The name golden tree among stars sounds beautiful, but the ecosystem isn't invulnerable. Deep-sea coral habitats are considered vulnerable marine ecosystems. They grow in environments that can be extremely difficult to study and potentially difficult to recover from disturbance. The more scientists explore these habitats, the more they realize that the deep ocean isn't an empty space waiting to be used. It contains communities, species, and evolutionary histories, many of which science is only beginning to understand. And some of them may not even have names yet. That's perhaps the most exciting question. If one coral can be so different, so genetically distinct, that scientists need an entirely new family, what else is down there? Another coral? Another strange animal? Another lineage that has been evolving separately for millions of years? Perhaps. And this isn't speculation pulled from nowhere. Scientists exploring other parts of the deep ocean have continued finding organisms that are new to science. In 2026, one deep-sea exploration effort off Brazil reported more than 30 previously unknown marine species, including jellyfish, siphonophores, comb jellies, worms, and other organisms. The message is becoming harder to ignore. The deep ocean isn't simply a place where a few rare creatures live. It is an enormous biological frontier. So imagine returning to that underwater landscape. The ROV descends, the sunlight disappears, the seafloor emerges from darkness, and then the golden coral appears, yellow branches rising from black volcanic rock, brittle stars covering the bottom like moving constellations. And somewhere in that darkness, a species that science had not formally recognized. Not because it was hiding behind a locked door, not because it was extinct, not because it lived on another planet. It was simply living in a place humans rarely visit. And when scientists finally looked closely, they discovered something extraordinary. A new species, a new genus, and an entirely new family. Laurinque elenya, a golden tree among stars in a world beneath the Pacific. And perhaps the most remarkable part of this story isn't that scientists found something new. It's that the ocean may still be filled with things, waiting for someone to look. This is Hidden Minds. The world is stranger than we think.